the Universal One, by Walter Russell. Chapter 11. Attraction and Repulsion. Every particle of matter in the universe is attracted to every other particle of matter in the universe. Every body attracts every other body with a force that varies directly as the product of their masses, and inversely as the square of the distance between them. No more fundamental principles have been written than these two Newtonian laws, and no laws have been more universally accepted. Concerning Newton's laws of gravitation, it is stated that they are the broadest and most fundamental which nature makes known to us. If it can be shown that the substance which we call matter has no inherent power to attract, but that it is motion alone which attracts, and if it can also be shown that the apparent ability of substance to attract through motion is equally true of its apparent ability to repel through motion, then the first of these laws is inaccurate and should be rewritten. Let us see whether the above law would not be more in keeping with the laws of motion if it were rewritten thus. Every mass has the relative apparent ability to attract and to repel every other mass, its relative ability depending on its relative potential. Let us now consider the varying power of mass to attract other mass according to the distance between them. If the second law is true, two equal masses of two different substances must attract each other equally from equal distances. If it can be shown that different masses do not attract each other equally, but rather that there is a significant range in the variability of the power of different masses to attract each other, then the law cannot be true. If it can also be shown that the apparent ability of mass to attract and also to repel increases and decreases in orderly ratios as volume, density, pressure, time, temperature, and other dimensions increase and decrease, then dimensions other than mass and distance should be considered in the formulation of the law. If it can be shown that the apparent power of attraction applies to all forming mass moving outward from the plane of concept toward the north, and that the apparent power of repulsion applies to all dissolving mass returning to the inertial plane of concept, then the second of these laws is inaccurate and should be rewritten. Let us see whether this law would not also be more in keeping with the laws of motion if it were rewritten thus. Every body attracts and repels every other body with a force that increases and decreases in universal ratios according to its potential position and the direction of the mass, whether toward the north or toward the south. This chapter will consider whether the attributes which we call attraction and repulsion belong to substance, and the succeeding chapters will consider what relation dimension has to the apparent ability of mass to attract. It is generally assumed that the substance of matter attracts, and that some other force repels. What exactly repels is not quite so certain, but the generally accepted theory is that it is light. Light is supposed to be different from the solid, cold matter of which other substances are composed. Light is supposed to repel. It does, but it also attracts, just as all substances both attract and repel. The word apparently must be understood as qualifying the above and all similar statements, and the word mass, when used, is assumed to mean an aggregate of states of motion of the substance, but not the substance itself. The tail of the comet, which always points away from the sun, is supposedly one of the proofs of the theory that light repels. If the head of the comet is its most solid part, and its tail proportionately less solid as its distance from the head increases, and if the pressure is greater the nearer to the sun, just as the pressure in water is greater the farther down, would not the tail of the comet seek the lower pressures and the head the higher, just as a cork tied to a nail with a string would float above the nail. Is not the opposition of pressures and the desire of potential to seek its own pressure zone just as acceptable an explanation as the theory of light repulsion? Is this explanation not also more logical? For is not the sun the great center of attraction in this system? If so, is it quite logical to say that the sun attracts and the sun's light repels? There is, however, a partial truth here, for light is accumulated energy that heats to incandescence as it accumulates, radiates as it heats, and expands as it radiates. Expansion is a state of corpuscular separation upon which the repulsion principle is based. The expansion pressure of radiation is a state of motion that pushes, just as the contraction pressure of generation is a state of motion that pulls. The other half of this truth is that light and mass are the same. Mass is also accumulated energy that cools as it radiates and contracts as it cools. Contraction is a state of corpuscular integration upon which the attraction principle is based. Here are two partial truths which trace the source of both opposites to the same focal center. Let us consider these two partial truths and see if they cannot be made into one whole truth. First, let us consider whether light or mass either repels or attracts as a substance or as an aggregate of substances, or whether it is motion alone that performs these miracles of whirling suns and planets in space. If light repels, something else must attract, for it would not be possible for light to do both. Yet the physicist bases the phenomenon of growing plant life on the ability of light to attract. The process, which he terms photosynthesis, is one in which the light of the sun is presumed to attract and assemble substances into form. Every physicist knows with certainty that light directed against a metallic plate will increase its positive charge. Moreover, various intensities and colors of light will vary the positive charge. Further still, various metals will vary greatly in their ability to absorb additional positive charge from the same sources of light. Additionally, metal plates that are overcharged by light will gradually lose that charge in the dark. Consider light in the aspect of a flame. The flame from a birch log rises rapidly in a direction radially away from the Earth's center, exactly opposite the direction in which a log of birch would fall. The birch log is the accumulated potential of contractive pressure and is consequently subject to gravitational pull, which is preponderant compared to the expansive pressure of radiational push. The flame from the birch log is a series of explosions that release the accumulated contractive pressure. The flame is a suddenly expanded radioactive release of energy that explosively and eagerly seeks the lower potential of pressures far removed, generating enough friction and heat to produce incandescence. The birch log and the flame from it are the same substance. The substance has merely reversed its pressure preponderance. Here is a substance that appears to attract when its power time is in preponderance and its volume contracted, and to repel when its speed time is in preponderance and its volume expanded. If substance attracts, something else must repel. It is unreasonable and illogical to say that substance can both attract and repel. What is there in this universe other than substance? There is the motion of substance. Does substance attract and motion repel? Let us consider this. We are familiar with the fact that warm air rises and cold air sinks. Here is the same substance proceeding in opposite directions, certainly not because of a difference in substance. We are familiar with rain falling to the ground and vapor rising to the clouds. Here again is the same substance proceeding in opposite directions. We are familiar with the expulsion of water by oil, of naphtha by water, of ether by naphtha, of hydrogen by air, and innumerable other substances that repel other substances for some good reason. We are also familiar with the fact that the ability of different substances to expel or repel each other is a relative one. We are familiar with the attraction of chlorine for sodium, of nickel for iron, of fluorine for hydrogen, of boron for nitrogen, of bromine for potassium, and innumerable other substances that attract other substances for some good reason. We are also familiar with the fact that the ability of different substances to attract each other is a relative one. We are also familiar with methods whereby opposing substances can be induced to attract each other by forcing a union under high pressure or by using a catalyst as a mediator. Likewise, we are familiar with methods that will separate bonds between united substances. Can it be possible, then, that substance has any relation to those qualities which we call attraction or repulsion? If by changing the volume of a mass, it rises instead of obeying the pull of gravitation, is it not reasonable and logical to assume that volume has some power to modify gravitational pull? If by changing the temperature of two equal masses of the same substance, they separate, and if by equalizing them, they come together, is it not reasonable and logical to assume that temperature has some relation to the phenomena of attraction and repulsion? If by changing the temperature of two equal masses of the same substance, it changes their volumes, densities, pressures, and all other dimensions, is it not logical to assume that dimension is in some manner related to the phenomena of attraction and repulsion? One needs no more convincing proof of the relative ability of mass to attract and to repel than this well-known characteristic of all elemental substances to find each other. When substances find each other, they also find their opposites, which revolve in exactly the same plane. Every state of motion is seeking a similar state of motion. Every state of motion has not only its own pressure zone, but its own plane. All of the elements of matter revolve in their own separate planes. The atoms of each element will eventually come together when released from locked positions in higher potentials. Every mass revolving in one plane resists the proximity of mass revolving in any other plane. Any compound mass of varying plane will eventually separate into its constituents, each of which will find its true position in its own plane and pressure zone. Every chemist is thoroughly aware of the relative ability of one mass to attract another, irrespective of distance. Every chemist knows that units of elements, called ions, break away from certain compounds with varying degrees of violence. The chemist calls this phenomenon ionization and thinks of it as a chemical effect, a reaction. Ions are masses. The law for one microscopic ion is the same as for a planet. If the chemist would think of all actions as gravitational and all reactions as radiational effects, he would know that ionization is due to the repellent, separative power of magnetic radioactive force to expel these little planetary ions, in order that magnetism may carry out its desire to diffuse electrically accumulated masses. The supposition that atomic motion is an electrical effect, and that the atoms of the elements are thereby exempted from obeying the laws of gravitation, misleads the chemist. He is also misled by the supposition that all matter is composed of exactly similar negative electrons and positive protons in different quantities, arranged differently in each kind of atom. The chemist assumes that there is one more electron in mercury than in gold. This new theory is now leading him to the expenditure of useless effort in trying to knock one electron out of mercury to produce gold. One might as well try to knock a planet out of our solar system. The fact is the reverse of the chemist's assumption. If one electron could be knocked out, and if that act would change mercury, the change would not be to gold. It would be to thallium or to lead. Likewise, one electron removed from lead would not produce mercury as hoped. It would result in bismuth. If one of our planets could be knocked out of our solar system, the event would increase our zodiacal expansion by at least 2 degrees and retard our solar evolution by at least 85 million years. The loss of one electron from the element mercury would be equivalent to a substantial discharge toward negative weakness. This discharge would cause the plane of mercury to increase its angle to the plane of lutetium, which would be the opposite effect necessary for the production of gold. The only way to change mercury to gold is to increase the contraction pressure of the mercurial atom, and thus change its plane to one slightly nearer that of the lutetium atom. The chemist recognizes the variable power of substance to attract and repel in that effect, which he has termed valency. Valency is purely an expression of gravitational variation, as ionization is an expression of radiational variation. The chemist knows that hydrogen and fluorine atoms, if released in a large room, will eagerly find each other. He knows also that hydrogen and carbon atoms released within an inch of one another will not find each other. On the contrary, they revolve in planes of such wide angles, and their relative positive charges are proportionately so unequal that they have to be forced together under the very high pressure of the arc lamp to make them combine. Every chemist knows the variability of pressure in every element at every temperature. Every physicist knows that condensation alters the direction of any vapor. The physicist tests the law of gravitation by producing a state of vacuum, which is non-existent in nature. In a vacuum, he finds that a feather and a piece of lead are attracted toward the center of the earth with the same velocity. This is a universe of varying pressures, and the production of an abnormal condition in a tube is not a test of the relative power of substance to attract or repel substance. If a tube large enough to enclose this planet and long enough to reach the sun's surface could be pumped free of its opposing pressures, the Earth would fall to the sun instead of floating in the orbit mapped out for it by the 2 opposing pressures that determine its position. Every physicist knows that the specific gravity of every element, compound, or mixture differs from that of any other. That quality in substance which we call weight is merely an indication of the apparent relative ability of substance to attract substance in proportion to its relative density and potential. Every metallurgist knows that some alloys can be produced very simply because of the willingness of some metals to unite and the great unwillingness of others. The metallurgist is accustomed to the use of high pressure in forcing his metals to unite, and the chemist to the use of very low pressures in causing his gases to unite. Modern science recognizes the varying power of substance to attract and repel in that effect termed electromotive force, but its basic cause is presumed to be electrical. Electricity and gravitation are not yet recognized as identical expressions of the same force. Modern science is perfectly familiar with the oscillatory motion of electromagnetic force, and also with the fact that opposed oscillations are opposed forces. All of the effects of motion are recorded as dimensions. Every dimension has its opposites, and every change in preponderance from one opposite to the other simultaneously changes every other one of the 18 series of opposites to balance that change. The force of attraction, which is electric, and the force of repulsion, which is magnetic, are both opposite pressure dimensions, and they must change their relations as other dimensions change. Neither the force of attraction nor the force of repulsion is in any way an attribute of the one universal substance. Substance has no power to attract, repel, unite, or separate. These qualities belong to motion and not to substance. If either of these qualities were attributes of substance, the unchanging one substance would then be changeable. All mass is accumulated electromagnetic potential, seeking the pressure zone of its potential. All mass is either charging, in which case it is flowing in an electric stream of centripetal preponderance, or it is discharging, in which case it is flowing in a magnetic stream of centrifugal preponderance. Mass flowing in a stream is conditioned by the current of the stream. An electric stream always flows spirally toward the gravitative center of the mass or system or wave of systems, toward the apex of each of their cones of energy. Magnetic streams always flow spirally toward the inertial planes of the mass or system or wave of systems, toward the bases of their cones of energy. These two streams pass each other going in opposite directions in the same cones of energy, and all mass carried by the streams is conditioned by their motion. Attraction and repulsion are merely apparent effects of electric action and magnetic reaction. Attraction and repulsion are the apparent effects of the opposites of motion. One is an effect of revolution, the other of rotation. One is an effect of gravitation, the other of radiation. One is an effect of contraction, the other of expansion. One is an effect of inhalation, the other of exhalation. One is an assembling or associating force, an assimilative force of gravity or growth, which causes mass to draw together, to integrate, to accumulate. The other is a disassembling or dissociating force, an eliminative force of emission, which causes mass to emanate, to separate, to disintegrate. One is the force of displacement, which generates high pressures as accumulated potential. The other is the force of replacement, which releases high pressures and accumulated potential into low pressures and low potential. In any mass, its constant of centripetal force is its constant of power to attract. In any mass, its constant of centrifugal force is its constant of power to repel. Let us consider these opposite effects of motion separately. First, let us consider the contractive pressure of electricity and its effect, which is that of attraction. Electricity attempts to displace substance by taking it from its expanded position in inertia, setting it in motion, and gathering it together in solid masses. Charging light units draw closer to each other. They appear to attract one another. They gravitate toward each other. They revolve around each other and rotate upon themselves. As they draw closer together, they charge each other, thus mutually assisting each other in remaining in their unstable position of displacement. Each part of every charging light unit or system appears to attract each other part irrespective of its potential. Contraction of volume is the inevitable effect. Accumulating mass absorbs heat. Higher electric pressure increases heat. Heat-absorbing light units are raising their potentials through vitalizing inhalation. They accumulate potential by nature's process of raising low potentials to the low melting points characteristic of low pressures and low potentials, and then freezing them into form at the low freezing points characteristic of low pressures and low potentials, and then repeating this process in the higher potentials of each succeeding octave of inhalation. Light units that are increasing their potentials are endothermic, contracting, generating light units. Generating light units or systems are centripetal. Their force is in the direction of nucleal centers of closing spirals. Centripetal, closing spirals pack accumulating mass more closely together into vortices, which are ever whirling toward the apices of ever-shortening cones. The whirling vortices of closing spirals of opposing cones become nucleal centers of maximum integration and maximum resistance to integration. They are the gravitative centers of forming systems. They are the focusing points toward which all charging light units of increasing potential and integrating mass fall and become absorbed as heat units of potential energy, and away from which all discharging light units of lowering potential and disintegrating mass rise and are radiated as heat emanations. Centripetal, closing spirals of opposing cones accumulate positive charge and its accompanying heat resistance into restricted areas at their melding apices, which form centers of gravitative force. The apices of spiral cones are the focusing points of the high potential of their systems. All light units of increasing potential decrease in volume as they approach these focusing points. Decrease in volume means increase in density. Increase in density is resisted by magnetic reaction and evidenced in heat. Heat radiates, radiation expands, and expansion cools the surface of the accumulated mass. Cold generates, generation contracts, contraction condenses. By this process, a contracting shell of high pressure is formed around any heated mass to prevent expansion, and the hot center ever increases in density as it cools. This is nature's method of changing dimensions of motion in order to produce apparently different substances with which to build the forms thought out by mind. No better illustration of nature's processes could be found than a comparison with man's processes of transforming iron into the appearance of other substances by exactly the same methods. Iron, superheated and plunged into icy water, will appear quite another substance than the iron of which it is composed. The same iron, or an iron alloy, when cooled in molten lead, will have other qualities not present when assembled by the metallurgist. The pressures employed by man in his processes of transformation give to the substances used by man many and varied appearances and forms. Just so with the pressures employed by nature in her processes of transformation by growth. Everything constructed by nature grows. Growth is an accumulation and assimilation of electric potential caused by endothermic, inhalative genero activity, followed by eliminative redistribution as the result of exhalative radioactivity. Nothing in nature evades the law of growth, nor knows another process. Nature assembles all her forms and transforms her assembled forms by raising their opposing pressures to high potentials from low potentials. Nature heats everything she wishes to transform through growth in high-pressure crucibles, and molds them by high pressure into the desired forms. Nature then subjects them to sudden or gradual cooling by sudden or gradual release of pressure, exactly as man cools his heated metals after molding them into the forms desired by him. Nature freezes her growing things at their characteristic low melting points with every exhalation, and melts more for accumulation with each sequential inhalation. Nature, the great engineer, builds a supporting framework of bone, or wood, or fiber for all her growing things, out of low octaves of high potentials, upon which she superimposes her flesh assembled from high octaves of low potentials. The frameworks of nature's structures require the locked potential positions of higher opposing pressures and higher melting points than are required by the flesh superimposed thereon. This is as true of the growing vegetable as of the growing solar system. The low temperature of our atmosphere supplies a sufficient furnace to bring the low potentials of the flesh of growing vegetables to their melting points. The low pressure of expansion then freezes them into the densities appropriate to their low pressures. The high opposing pressures and temperatures of the sun do exactly the same thing. Planets are melted in its furnace and molded into shape by the opposing pressure walls, which trim and prune them into harmonic spheres of dimensions proportionate to their potential positions. High pressures produce more dense substances of greater strength for the framework of nature's structures, whether those structures are vegetables, animals, or solar systems. An increase in density means a decrease in the axial speed time dimension and an increase in the orbital power time dimension. Expanded substances are described by chemists as active and contracted substances as inactive. Gases, for example, are classed as active and solids as inactive states of substances. That is because expanded substances unite more readily in low potential positions, where expansion pressure has separated light units to great distances. They are so expanded that they integrate readily. Their opposing streams join. Hard substances, on the contrary, do not unite so readily in the low pressures of this planet. They require the force of such high opposing pressures as those of our sun to make them unite. Two gases such as fluorine 501 and lithium 501 plus will leap together with explosive violence in ordinary atmospheric pressure. Pour several liquids in the same stream, and soon they will all blend if the planes of their atoms are not too far removed. A stream of metal balls would require the pressure force of a very high temperature to expand their particles so that they would blend as one liquid metal stream. The constant of activity would not in any way be changed by thus changing its dimensions. The metal would not become more active by expanding it. The expansion would merely retard one time dimension and accelerate the other. It was not less active while it was contracted. What it lacked in activity of rotation is made up for in activity of revolution. Activity never lessens and inactivity never increases because of any change of dimension. Every expression of motion has its equal and opposite expression. There can be no increase or decrease in any effect of motion without a balancing increase or decrease in its opposite effect. An apparent decrease in activity of a dense mass is merely a lessening of the speed of rotation and a balancing increase of the speed of revolution. There are two speeds, two opposing speeds, which are equal and opposite. To apply the brake to one is to accelerate the other and vice versa. Just so with volume. Expanded volume has less apparent ability to attract. Therefore, there must be relatively less positive charge in expanded volume than in contracted volume. The volume of a hydrogen or lithium atom is greater than that of a beryllium atom, and the volume of beryllium is greater than that of boron. The boron atom has greater power to attract and greater power to repel than the beryllium atom. The power to attract lessens as volume increases. The power to repel also lessens as volume increases. This is true in every one of the octaves of the elements, in every element, in every atom of every element, and in every planet and light unit of every atom. Each element has a different volume and mass, and each one, in accordance with its potential position, has a separate and individual ratio of attraction and repulsion power. In any mass, the decrease in volume is in exact proportion to the increase in its potential. In any mass, the decrease in volume is in exact proportion to the increase in positive charge, contraction pressure, and temperature. A mass of less volume is of relatively higher potential, greater positive charge, and greater pressure than a similar mass of greater volume. A mass of less volume is contracted mass, and a similar mass of greater volume is expanded mass. Contracting mass draws away from similar, expanding mass in the opposite direction, forming an eccentric orbit of revolution around the nucleal center of its system. The orbit of any contracting mass is ever drawing closer to the nucleal center of its system, enclosing spiral lines. All mass with a decreasing orbit is ever accelerating its speed of revolution in that orbit. All of the conditions precedent to the appearance of increasing ability of mass to attract and to repel have 8 conspicuous effects in common. These are increasing centripetal preponderance, pressure, temperature, speed of revolution, and positive charge, and decreasing volume, area of orbit, and speed of rotation. On the contrary, all of the conditions precedent to the appearance of decreasing ability of mass to attract and to repel have the 8 opposite effects in common. These are decreasing centrifugal preponderance, pressure, temperature, speed of revolution, and negative discharge, and increasing volume, area of orbit, and speed of rotation. In any mass, the greater its speed of revolution, the greater its power to attract and to repel. In any mass, the greater its speed of rotation, the less its power to attract and to repel. As all mass is constantly changing both of these dimensions, all mass is varying in its ability to attract and to repel. Revolution is the opposite of rotation. One exactly balances the other in accordance with the law that there can be no increase or decrease in any effect of motion without a balancing decrease or increase in its opposite effect. Also, one eventually overtakes the other in accordance with the universal law of sequential preponderance in all opposite effects of motion. Revolution is an effect of motion employed by electricity to increase surface tension pressure in order that it may accomplish its desire of converting the universe into solids. Electricity conquers magnetism in its sequentially preponderant power of generation and regeneration. Rotation is an effect of motion employed by magnetism to counteract the desire of electricity by dissociating that which electricity has associated. Magnetism conquers electricity in its sequentially preponderant power of degenerating that which electricity has generated. All mass is simultaneously electric and magnetic, but preponderantly one or the other cumulatively in endless repetitive sequence. All mass simultaneously revolves and rotates, though one effect is always preponderant, while the other is preparing for its right of preponderance. All opposite effects of motion are simultaneous in the expression of their sex opposition, but preponderant in sequence in each sex expression. Each oscillation of the opposing electric and magnetic forces is simultaneous, but one is greater than the other. In this universe of more and less, all division into the more and the less occurs simultaneously, but both unequal divisions are cumulative in their inequality. One always overtakes and overbalances the other, though both are progressing in opposite directions. Man's inhalation, for example, is simultaneously accompanied in a lesser degree by his exhalation, and conversely, his exhalation is accompanied in a lesser degree by his inhalation. While he is inhaling in preponderance through his nostrils, he is exhaling in a lesser degree through every pore of his body. Conversely, while he is exhaling in preponderance through his nostrils, he is inhaling in a lesser degree through his body. The time will eventually come when the inhalation-exhalation sequences will become preponderant through his pores. He will then gradually lose vitality until disintegration has conquered his ability to integrate sufficiently to hold his body together as a unit. Degeneration will eventually conquer generation until regeneration again has its turn. All ideas are repetitive, and no effect of motion once started ever ends. The end of an octave is but the beginning of another octave. The end of a cycle is but the beginning of another cycle. The end of a wave is but the beginning of another wave. Also, the end of a life is but the beginning of another life. There is no death. Man cannot die, nor can motion end, nor can idea evade repetitiveness, nor can sex evade its sequential preponderance. Attraction and repulsion are opposite sex effects. If the law which states that all opposite effects of motion are simultaneous in the expression of their sex opposition, but preponderant in sequence in each sex expression, is sound, then all mass which attracts also simultaneously repels. Also, one of these qualities is preponderant in proportion to the preponderance of one or the other states of motion which determines the potential of the mass. Furthermore, if the law is true, any mass which is preponderant in its power to attract eventually becomes preponderant in its power to repel. If this is true, any mass which is increasing its power to attract must also be increasing its power to repel in excess of the increase in power to attract in order to attain its alternate right of preponderance. Conversely, for the same reason, any mass which is decreasing its power to attract must also be decreasing its power to repel in excess of the decrease in power to attract. The excess in each instance is in universal ratio. If this is true, there must be a point of equilibrium where the preponderance of gravitational power passes to preponderance of radiational power at both ends of the cycle of motion. At these points, motion is impossible except that which is continued by impetus, for in such an equilibrium there could be no force to cause motion. It has been contended that matter could not both attract and repel for the very reason that one would counteract the other and prevent motion. This would be true if the opposing states of motion were exactly balanced in every mass. This is true only at the two passing points above referred to, for at all other positions in the wave of energy, the opposing charges are unequally balanced. Sex is the result. The two passing points where the opposing forces are in equilibrium are the sexless position 0 equal sign and the double tone bisexual 4%, which mark the limitations of motion in any wave of energy. The sexless position is chemically registered in the inert gases, herein known as the master tones, and the bisexual position is herein known as the carbon line. Through these two passing points, energy can continue only because of impetus. At these two passing points, all effects of motion are reversed. The orbit of expanding mass is ever drawing away from the apex of the cone of its system in opening spiral lines, following the contour of the cone toward its base. All mass of expanding orbit is ever decelerating its speed of revolution and accelerating its speed of rotation, discharging light units or systems separate or draw away from each other, and also draw away from charging light units or systems. They not only appear to repel each other, but also seem to be repellent within themselves. Each part of every discharging light unit or system appears to repel each other part, irrespective of its potential. It radiates away from adjoining masses. It expands from within itself, even as does the system of which it is a part. As light units separate one from another, they discharge each other. Discharging light units are those which are releasing potential through devitalizing exhalation. Light units or systems which are decreasing their potential are exothermal, expanding. Radiating light units. Radiating light units or systems are centrifugal. Their force is in the direction of the expanding orbits of opening spirals. The purpose of magnetism is to replace that which electricity has displaced, to dissociate, disassemble, diffuse, disintegrate, and radiate that which electricity has associated, assembled, integrated, and generated. Centrifugal opening spirals distribute disintegrating mass over more expanded ecliptic areas and break up the nucleal gravitative centers by distributing positive charge over proportionately greater areas, which are in equilibrium with the greater areas of negative discharge, thus reducing potential by replacement of that which has been displaced. It has been written that all motion is spiral and all direction is curved. All direction is also universal. All mass follows spiral orbits, either northerly toward or southerly away from gravitative centers of systems. All mass seeks the ever-changing pressure zones of its own ever-changing potentials, revolving and rotating always from west toward east, without any exception in any mass throughout the universe of dimension. Neither the effect of attraction nor the effect of repulsion is due to substance, but to centripetal and centrifugal force of motion. The effect of attraction belongs to positive electric charge, and this, in its turn, to electric domination. The effect of repulsion belongs to negative electric discharge, and this, in its turn, to magnetic domination. One need have no better illustration of this truth than the piece of iron which leaps to one pole of a magnet and apparently is repelled by the other pole. If the attributes of attraction and repulsion belong to substance, instead of to motion, the iron of the magnet would either attract toward any of its parts or repel from them all. Much of the misunderstanding regarding the effects of the so-called magnet is due to a lack of knowledge of electric and magnetic action and the universality of direction. An electric stream is flowing swiftly toward the apex of every one of the countless opposing spirals within the magnetic bar. Each opposing spiral cone of energy changes its relations in a manner which will later be made clear. The pressure and velocity of the stream within each cone of the magnetized bar increase in inverse ratio to the square of the lessened distance and to the cube of the lessened volume, as the volume is compressed into closer quarters. The electric excitation of the magnetized bar increases the oscillation of the little pumps of which all matter in motion is composed. The breathing of the light units of the magnetized iron is faster than that of the normal iron. The inhalation-exhalation sequences are so vastly increased that a normal piece of iron falls toward the direction of the flow, exactly as heavy trees are uprooted and sucked into the maelstrom of the spirally swirling cones of a cyclone. The effects above described are effects of gravitative preponderance, which universally increase in the direction of north, and north is always at the conical apices of two opposed spiral electric streams which meet at gravitative centers. Substance has no relation to gravitative or radiative effects. Neither pole is attracted to or repelled by the other. One might as reasonably assert that logs which are speeding through the sluice of an open dam are attracted by the dam and then repelled by it, rather than being carried by the movement of the rushing waters. Or one might as reasonably assert that houses and trees, which are being sucked into the cone of a whirlwind, are attracted by the wind, rather than by the motion of the wind. The electromagnet, which it properly should be called, does to the iron filings exactly what the whirlwind does to the houses and trees. The accompanying drawing will show clearly how all of our familiar and safe wind pressures are upset when opposing whirlwind cones sweep over the land. All effects of motion are whirlwinds. The nearer the gravitative center, the greater the whirlwind. The solar system is a whirlwind with Mercury swirling swiftly near the gravitative center, where the vast pressures whirl it around the Sun in 88 days at a speed of about 30 miles per second, against the Earth's 18 miles, Jupiter's 8, and Neptune's leisurely 3 miles per second. The gravitative center of any mass in motion is the point of greatest density and least speed of rotation. The center of any rotating mass is the point of least axial speed. Motion ceases at the vortex of a whirlpool in the equilibrium of maximum motion in opposition. Magnetic streams flow universally toward the south, just as electric streams flow universally toward the north. Electric streams degenerate into magnetic streams, which find their south at the bases of cones in which the maximum motion is always in the plane of the equator of the rotating mass. These are the planes of radiation where the maximum radioactive force is near the equator, the hottest part of the surface of any mass. The centers of the bases of the generative cones are at the poles of rotation, the coldest part of any mass. Mass is disintegrated by a magnetic force exerted equatorially, just as it is integrated by an electric force exerted axially. Just as the phenomenon of attraction is caused by the flow of a centripetal stream whirling spirally with ever-increasing swiftness toward the vortex in the apex of the cone of its spiral, so is the phenomenon of repulsion caused by the flow of a centrifugal stream whirling spirally with ever-decreasing swiftness toward the base of the cone of its spiral. The electric stream displaces substance by accumulating the universal constant under increasingly higher pressure equilibriums into relatively solid masses, and the magnetic stream diffuses that solidity into tenuity by releasing those high pressures. Affinity, in the chemical sense, and attraction in the electrical sense, are analogous. Both are effects of gravitation. The attraction of gravitation is but a resultant of centripetal force, of which deceleration of the speed-time dimension of the universal constant and acceleration of power-time is the condition precedent. Unequal valency in the chemical sense and repulsion in the magnetic sense are analogous. The repulsion of radiation is but a resultant of centrifugal force, of which acceleration of the speed-time dimension of the universal constant and deceleration of power-time is the condition precedent. The preponderance of one of the opposites of motion is, therefore, the condition which must be present in mass, in order for it to be preponderant in its ability either to attract or to repel. Substance, then, merely appears to attract or to repel, and that appearance is relative. Both forces are equal. A preponderance of one is balanced in its opposite by a preponderance of the other. The two, added together, cause an appearance of stability which is maintained for a time by motion. The relative ability of a substance to attract and to repel is in the same ratio as the increase or decrease of the opposing pressures and other dimensions, which determine the potential of a charging or discharging system. In any mass, the apparent ability to attract increases with an increase in positive charge and a decrease in volume. Also, the apparent ability to repel increases with an increase in negative discharge and a decrease in volume. Please stay tuned for more of the Universal One. Peace, blessings, and much love to you all.